Have you ever wondered what happens when desperation meets magic in the dead of night? When a man's final hope becomes the foundation for something extraordinary that defies every law of reality we think we know. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the real story behind one of the most beloved fairy tales ever told, and I promise you, the truth is far stranger and more haunting than anything the Brothers Grimm ever put to paper. My name is Marcus, and I've spent the last 15 years researching forgotten histories, lost manuscripts, and the dark corners of folklore that most people prefer to leave undisturbed. What I discovered about the Elves and the Shoemaker will fundamentally change how you see this innocent bedtime story forever. Because this isn't just a tale about magical helpers and grateful cobblers. This is a story about sacrifice, ancient contracts written in blood and moonlight, and the terrifying price that comes with accepting help from beings that exist beyond our understanding of the natural world. But before we dive into the real events that inspired this fairy tale, let me paint you a picture of medieval Europe that the sanitized versions never show you. Picture cobblestone streets slick with refuse and rain where the stench of unwashed bodies mingles with the metallic tang of blood from the butcher shops. Where winter means death for anyone without coin or connections, and where a single bad harvest can reduce entire families to begging in the streets. This was the world of Heinrich Zimmermann, a shoemaker whose story would become legend, though not for the reasons you might think. Heinrich lived in a cramped workshop on the outskirts of Nuremberg in the winter of 1623. The 30 Years' War had been raging for 5 brutal years, turning the German countryside into a wasteland of burned villages and mass graves. Trade routes had collapsed, noble families had fled or been slaughtered, and the common people who remained scraped by on whatever scraps they could find. For a craftsman like Heinrich, whose livelihood depended on customers with disposable income, these were the darkest of times. His workshop, once bustling with apprentices and filled with the finest leather imported from across Europe, had been reduced to a single room where he worked alone by candlelight. The tools that had been passed down through 3 generations of his family, tools that had crafted shoes for merchants and minor nobility, now sat unused on dusty shelves. His wife Anna had died of plague 2 summers prior, and their only son had marched off with a mercenary company, never to return. Heinrich was utterly, completely alone. The night everything changed started like any other. Heinrich sat hunched over his workbench, squinting at a piece of worn leather by the flickering light of his last candle. His hands, once steady and sure, trembled from hunger and exhaustion as he tried to cut the pattern for what would be his final pair of shoes. The leather itself was barely worthy of the name, a thin, scarred hide that he'd traded his wedding ring to obtain. But it was all he had left, the absolute last material in his possession. As he worked, Heinrich spoke aloud to the empty workshop, a habit he'd developed since Anna's death to ward off the crushing silence. He told the shadows about better days, about the time he'd crafted dancing slippers for the Duke's daughter, about the pride he'd felt when customers would travel from neighbouring towns just to commission his work. But mostly, he talked about his fear. Fear of the landlord who would surely evict him within days. Fear of the approaching winter with no food stored away. Fear of dying alone and forgotten, just another casualty of a war that seemed to devour everything good in the world. The candle guttered and died just as Heinrich finished cutting the upper portion of his final shoe. In the sudden darkness, something shifted in the workshop. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in the quality of the air itself, as if the very atoms had rearranged themselves while he wasn't looking. Heinrich fumbled for his tinderbox, his heart hammering against his ribs, but before he could strike a light, he heard something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Footsteps. Tiny, deliberate footsteps moving across his workshop floor with purpose and intelligence. But these weren't the scurrying sounds of rats or the padding of a stray cat. These footsteps had rhythm, coordination, the unmistakable cadence of small beings moving with intention. Heinrich pressed himself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe, as the sounds multiplied. First 1 set of steps, then 2. then what seemed like dozens of tiny feet moving through his workshop with impossible precision in the absolute darkness. Then came the sounds of work beginning. The distinctive whisper of awl through leather, the soft tap of tiny hammers, the gentle scrape of knives paring and shaping. Heinrich recognized every sound, had made them himself thousands of times, but hearing them performed by invisible hands in the depths of night filled him with a terror so profound that he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even close his eyes. For what felt like hours, he listened to his craft being performed by beings that should not exist, while his rational mind tried desperately to convince him that hunger and despair had finally driven him completely mad. When dawn's first light crept through the shuttered window, the sounds ceased as suddenly as they had begun. Heinrich waited another full hour before he dared to move, his muscles cramped and aching from holding the same position all night. With trembling hands, he lit a new candle and approached his workbench, expecting to find his meagre materials scattered or destroyed. Instead, he discovered something that defied every law of nature and craft he had ever known. There, sitting perfectly on his workbench, was the most exquisite pair of shoes he had ever seen. Not just completed, but completed with a skill that surpassed anything Heinrich had ever achieved in 20 years of dedicated craftsmanship. Every stitch was flawless, each piece of leather cut and shaped with mathematical precision. The shoes seemed to glow with their own inner light, as if they had been crafted not just from leather and thread, but from concentrated beauty itself. But as Heinrich examined the shoes more closely, he noticed details that filled him with growing unease. The stitching, while perfect, followed patterns he had never seen before. Symbols and designs that seemed to writhe and shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The leather, which had been rough and scarred when he'd obtained it, now bore a texture that was somehow wrong. Too smooth, too supple, with an almost organic warmth that suggested it had never belonged to any earthly animal. And there was something else, something that made Heinrich's craftsman instincts scream in alarm, even as his desperate circumstances urged him to ignore his fears. The shoes were too perfect. Not just well-made, but impossibly, unnaturally perfect in ways that human hands could never achieve. The kind of perfection that came with a price that hadn't been negotiated yet, but would surely be collected eventually. Heinrich spent the rest of that day staring at the shoes, torn between wonder and terror. His rational mind told him to throw them into the fire, to destroy this evidence of forces beyond his understanding, before they could destroy him in return. But his empty stomach and the notice of eviction nailed to his door told a different story. These shoes represented salvation, the possibility of customers, of income, of survival through another brutal winter. By noon, Heinrich had made his decision. He carefully wrapped the mysterious shoes in his finest remaining cloth and set out for the market square, his heart pounding with each step. The streets of Nuremberg were as bleak as ever, filled with beggars and hollow-eyed survivors of the endless war. But Heinrich walked with a purpose he hadn't felt in months. He knew that if these shoes were discovered to be the work of supernatural forces, he could face charges of witchcraft. The church had been particularly zealous in recent years, burning anyone suspected of consorting with demons or practicing dark arts. The first person to examine his work was Wilhelm Brenner, a wealthy merchant who had managed to maintain his fortune even as the war consumed everything around him. Brenner was notorious for his sharp eye and sharper tongue, a man who could spot inferior craftsmanship from across a room and wasn't shy about voicing his opinions. Heinrich watched nervously as Brenner turned the shoes over in his hands, examining every detail with the intensity of a man inspecting precious gems. What happened next would haunt Heinrich for the rest of his days. Brenner's expression shifted from casual interest to absolute amazement, then to something approaching religious awe. The merchant's hands began to shake as he traced the impossible stitching, his eyes wide with disbelief. Without a word, Brenner reached into his purse and counted out enough silver coins to feed Heinrich for 6 months. He didn't negotiate, didn't haggle, didn't even ask about the price. He simply paid what the shoes were worth to him, which was apparently everything he had on his person. Word spread through the market like wildfire. Within hours, Heinrich found himself surrounded by customers clamoring for shoes of their own. Nobles who had fled their estates, wealthy merchants, even church officials who normally wouldn't lower themselves to speak with common tradesmen. They all wanted to commission work from the cobbler who could create footwear that defied human comprehension. Heinrich took their orders and their gold, promising delivery within a week, all while knowing that he had no idea how to fulfill a single commission. That night, Heinrich returned to his workshop with enough money to solve his immediate problems and a terror so deep it felt like drowning. He arranged his materials exactly as he had the night before, cutting patterns for multiple pairs of shoes before extinguishing his candle and retreating to the corner to wait. The darkness seemed thicker this time, pregnant with expectation and something else, something that felt like watching eyes and patient hunger. The tiny footsteps came earlier than before, accompanied by sounds Heinrich hadn't noticed the previous night. Whispers in a language that predated human speech, soft chittering that might have been laughter or might have been something far more sinister. As the night progressed, Heinrich realized he could make out individual voices among the workers, each one distinct and terrifyingly intelligent. They spoke to each other in their ancient tongue, but occasionally they would switch to German, discussing his customers by name, revealing intimate details about their lives that no earthly being should have known. They knew about Wilhelm Brenner's secret affairs, about the church official's hidden cache of stolen relics, about the nobleman's plans to betray his allies for profit. They spoke of these things with casual amusement, as if human corruption was nothing more than entertainment for their kind. But what chilled Heinrich to his core was when they began discussing him. They knew about Anna's death, about his son's fate with the mercenary company, about the desperation that had driven him to this moment. They spoke of his future with the certainty of beings who existed outside linear time, who could see the threads of fate as clearly as Heinrich could see leather and thread. By morning, 6 pairs of shoes sat on his workbench, each one more magnificent than the last. But Heinrich noticed changes in his workshop that hadn't been there before. Tools had been moved to new positions, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Symbols had been carved into his wooden workbench, marks that seemed to pulse with their own dark energy. And there was a smell in the air, faint but unmistakable, like copper pennies mixed with flowers that had been rotting for centuries. Heinrich delivered the shoes as promised, collecting payment that made him temporarily wealthy. But with each transaction, he noticed something disturbing about his customers. They weren't just satisfied with their purchases. They were obsessed. Wilhelm Brenner wore his shoes constantly, even to bed, claiming they brought him luck in his business dealings. The church official's demeanour had changed entirely, becoming secretive and paranoid, muttering prayers in languages Heinrich didn't recognise. The nobleman had begun hosting strange gatherings in his mansion, inviting guests who arrived only after midnight and left before dawn. The pattern continued for weeks. Each night, Heinrich would prepare materials for the mysterious craftsman, and each morning he would find perfect shoes waiting for him. Each day, he would sell these creations to customers who seemed to fall under their spell immediately upon taking possession. The gold accumulated in hidden pouches throughout his workshop, more wealth than he had ever dreamed of possessing. But so did the signs that he was involved in something far beyond simple supernatural assistance. The changes weren't limited to his customers. Heinrich began experiencing vivid dreams filled with images of ancient forests where trees grew in impossible geometries, of cities built from materials that didn't exist in the natural world, of ceremonies conducted by beings whose forms shifted and writhed like living shadows. He would wake exhausted, as if he had been travelling great distances while he slept, sometimes finding dirt under his fingernails that didn't match the soil around Nuremberg. His own reflection began to trouble him. His eyes, once a warm brown, had developed flecks of gold that seemed to move when he wasn't paying attention. His hands, skilled though they had always been, now moved with a precision that felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. When he worked during the day, creating his own inferior shoes to maintain the pretense of normal craftsmanship, he found himself unconsciously incorporating symbols and patterns that he had no memory of learning. The breaking point came on a night in late November when the first snows had begun to fall and the city had taken on the hushed quality that winter brings to places where survival is never guaranteed. Heinrich had prepared materials for what would become his most ambitious commission yet, shoes for the bishop himself, who had heard rumours of the miraculous cobbler and demanded to see the work firsthand. As he arranged the finest leather he could acquire, Heinrich noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The leather bore marks, tiny puncture wounds arranged in patterns that looked disturbingly like the symbols carved into his workbench. As he examined the hide more closely, Heinrich realized these weren't random marks or signs of poor tanning. They were deliberately placed, purposeful, part of some design that extended far beyond the creation of simple footwear. The leather itself seemed to pulse with a life of its own, warm to the touch despite the bitter cold of the workshop. That night, as the mysterious craftsmen began their work, Heinrich crept closer than he had ever dared before. He had to see them, had to understand what he had gotten himself involved with, regardless of the consequences. Moving with painstaking care, he positioned himself behind a stack of old leather hides where he could observe the workbench while remaining hidden in shadow. What he saw would shatter his understanding of reality forever. The beings working at his bench were not elves, as the fairy tales would later claim. They were something far older, far more alien to human understanding. Their forms seemed to exist in constant flux, shifting between solid matter and something that resembled living shadow. When Heinrich focused directly on one of them, it appeared almost human-shaped, but impossibly small, no larger than his hand. But when he looked away and relied on his peripheral vision, they seemed to stretch and writhe like smoke given consciousness and malevolent purpose. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were the most disturbing aspect of all. Where eyes should have been, there were hollow spaces that seemed to contain entire galaxies of swirling darkness. Their mouths opened far wider than any earthly creatures should, revealing rows of teeth that looked like tiny needles made from polished bone. When they spoke to each other in their ancient language, their voices harmonized in ways that created sounds Heinrich had never heard before, frequencies that made his bones ache and his vision blur around the edges. But it was their hands that truly revealed their inhuman nature. Each being possessed far too many fingers, and those fingers moved with a fluidity that defied every joint and muscle Heinrich understood. They could bend their digits in impossible directions, stretch them to lengths that should have snapped bone, and manipulate tools with a dexterity that seemed to mock human limitations. As they worked, their hands occasionally became translucent, allowing Heinrich to see the leather through their flesh as if they existed only partially in his reality. The tools they used were both familiar and utterly wrong. Heinrich recognized the basic shapes of awls and needles, hammers and knives, but these implements seemed to be crafted from materials that hurt to look at directly. Some appeared to be made from crystallized moonlight, others from what looked like fossilized screams given physical form. When they cut the leather, the tools left wounds that bled darkness instead of normal blood, staining the hide with patterns that formed symbols Heinrich was certain he had never seen before, yet somehow understood on a level deeper than conscious thought. As the night progressed, Heinrich began to comprehend the true nature of the work being performed. These beings weren't simply making shoes, they were creating artifacts, items imbued with power that transcended mere craftsmanship. Each stitch was a binding spell, each cut a deliberate weakening of the barriers between worlds. The shoes weren't just footwear, they were conduits, gateways through which these ancient beings could extend their influence into the human realm. The leather itself underwent transformations that defied natural law. Under their ministrations, the rough hide became smooth as silk, but more than that, it began to exhibit properties that no earthly material should possess. Heinrich watched in horrified fascination as the leather seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting rhythmically, like living tissue. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of what looked like veins running through the material, pulsing with a light that reminded him uncomfortably of the phosphorescence he had once seen on rotting fish. The being's conversation, when Heinrich could catch fragments he understood, revealed the true scope of their plan. They spoke of contracts written in languages that predated human civilization, of debts that accumulated across generations, of a harvest that had been planned since before Henrik's grandfather's grandfather had been born. Every pair of shoes they created was another thread in a web that stretched across the entire city, connecting their wearers in ways that the humans couldn't perceive but couldn't escape. Henrik learned that Wilhelm Brenner wasn't just lucky in his business dealings. The shoes were guiding his decisions, leading him towards specific choices that served the being's unknowable agenda. The church official wasn't becoming paranoid without reason. His enhanced perception was allowing him to see truths about his fellow clergy that were driving him toward madness. The nobleman's midnight gatherings weren't social events. They were rituals performed by unwitting participants who believed they were simply enjoying exclusive entertainment. But the most chilling revelation came when Henrik realized the beings were aware of his presence. Without turning from their work, without any change in their movements or conversation, one of them spoke directly to him in perfect German, its voice carrying the weight of centuries and the promise of consequences that stretch beyond death itself. Heinrich Zimmermann, it said, the words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Son of Klaus the cobbler, grandson of Wilhelm the leatherworker, great-grandson of Friedrich, who first learned to speak with the things that dwell between shadows and starlight. Did you think this was coincidence? Did you believe that desperation alone brought us to your workshop on that first cold night? Henrik's blood turned to ice as the implications crashed over him. This wasn't a random supernatural intervention. This was the fulfillment of something that had been set in motion generations ago, a debt that had been accumulating interest through his entire bloodline. His great-grandfather, a man he had known only through family stories and half-remembered legends, had apparently made some kind of bargain with these beings. Everything that had followed, every choice his family had made, every turn their lives had taken, had been guided toward this moment. Your great-grandfather, Friedrich, was dying of plague, the being continued, its needle-like teeth glinting in the candlelight that somehow still burned despite Henrik having never lit another candle. His children were starving, his wife was already dead, and the winter promised to kill anyone without resources to survive it. Sound familiar, Heinrich? History has such an amusing way of repeating itself, especially when we arrange the circumstances. The creature's companions continued their work, but Henrik could sense their attention focusing on him like predators evaluating prey. The workshop felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were pressing inward, trapping him with these beings whose true nature he was only beginning to understand. Friedrich begged for help just as you did, though he was wise enough to offer something concrete in exchange, not just his own service, but the service of his bloodline. A family of craftsmen who would perfect our work across generations, whose skills would grow ever more refined until they were ready to serve our greater purpose. You, Heinrich, are the culmination of that breeding program, the final product of 3 generations of careful guidance and genetic refinement. Henrik tried to speak, to protest, to deny what he was hearing, but found that his voice had abandoned him entirely. His throat worked soundlessly as the truth settled into his mind like poison seeping into groundwater. Every skill he possessed, every technique he had learned, every instinctive understanding of leather and tools and the creation of beautiful things had been cultivated by these beings for their own purposes. Your wife Anna's death was not random plague, the being said, its tone carrying a casual cruelty that was somehow more terrifying than outright malice. We needed you isolated, desperate, broken enough to accept our help without questioning its nature too deeply. Your son's departure with the mercenary company was arranged through carefully placed suggestions and manufactured opportunities. We needed you alone, without human connections that might interfere with the work ahead. The workshop filled with sounds that Henrik's ears weren't designed to process. Harmonics that seemed to vibrate through his bones, frequencies that made his vision blur and his balance falter. The being's true forms became more visible as whatever glamour had been concealing them began to fade. They were larger than he had first perceived, their limbs extending in directions that geometry couldn't accommodate. Some possessed wings that looked like they had been flayed from enormous bats. Others had appendages that seemed to be made from crystallized music, given physical form. The shoes we have created are not merely footwear, Heinrich. They are anchors, binding points that allow us to extend our realm into yours. Each person who wears them becomes a conduit through which we can influence your world more directly. Wilhelm Brenner's business success comes at the cost of his humanity slowly draining away. The church official's enhanced perception is preparation for the day when we will need him to perform specific rituals. The nobleman's gatherings are practice sessions for ceremonies that will open doorways between dimensions. Henrik's workshop was transforming around him. The familiar walls were becoming transparent, revealing landscapes that couldn't exist in any earthly realm. Twisted spires reached towards skies filled with stars that moved in patterns that hurt to follow. Forests of trees that grew downward into abyssal depths while their roots clawed upward toward alien constellations. Cities built from materials that shifted between solid matter and pure concept, inhabited by beings that made the creatures in his workshop look almost human by comparison. Your role in this grand design is nearly complete, the being said, its attention returning to its work even as it continued speaking. Soon, we will have enough anchor points throughout your city to begin the true harvest. The barriers between our realm and yours will weaken enough for us to manifest directly. When that day comes, Nuremberg will become the first city in your world to be properly integrated into our empire. Its citizens will serve us as they were always meant to, and their suffering will sustain us for centuries to come. The being paused in its work, one of its impossible hands reaching toward a tool that looked like crystallized screaming. But first we need one final pair of shoes, a masterwork that will serve as the keystone for everything we have built. Shoes crafted not just with supernatural skill, but imbued with the life force of their creator. Your life force, Heinrich. Your blood, your breath, your soul, woven into leather and thread to create an artifact of such power that reality itself will bend around it. Henrik found his voice at last, though it came out as little more than a whisper. And if I refuse? The workshop filled with sounds that might have been laughter, if laughter could carry the weight of cosmic malevolence and the promise of torments that stretched beyond the boundaries of human imagination. Refuse, the being said, its voice carrying amusement that was somehow more terrifying than its earlier threats. Dear Heinrich, you misunderstand the nature of your situation entirely. You cannot refuse because you have already accepted. Every night you have prepared materials for us. Every morning you have taken our work and sold it. Every coin you have accepted in payment has bound you more tightly to our service. The contract was signed not with ink but with intention. Your desperate need, your willing acceptance of our help, your choice to profit from our work despite your growing suspicions, all of it has created chains that no human power can break. And so Heinrich Zimmermann's fate was sealed, not by trickery or deception, but by his own desperate choices made in humanity's darkest hours. The real story behind the Elves and the Shoemaker reveals a truth far more terrifying than any fairy tale, a reminder that when we accept help from forces beyond our understanding, we must be prepared to pay prices we never imagined. Heinrich's workshop still stands in Nuremberg today, though locals avoid it after dark. Some say you can still hear the sound of tiny hammers working leather in the depths of night, crafting shoes for customers who will never truly understand what they've purchased. The next time you hear this innocent bedtime story, remember Heinrich's choice and ask yourself what you might accept when desperation meets the promise of salvation in the darkness.